Balance is the wrong criterion and a cover for a witch hunt. What we need is a search for the truth. Education, real academic freedom, critical thinking, and dissent. Let's begin this by talking about David Horowitz and the Hitler Youth. Horowitz himself, and the reason I deliberately use that formulation, is in important ways spearheading a concerted drive to attack critical thinking and dissent in academia, and in that way to more effectively attack critical thinking and dissent in society as a whole. And in this, he's not some, once again, lone extremist, right-wing fanatic, former revisionist, Communist Party member or supporter turned right-wing, turned born-again, right-wing lunatic. He is all those things. But he's not just those things. He's tied in with very powerful forces in the ruling class, right up to the key operatives in the Bush administration and key politicians, such as the governor of Colorado, where a lot of this focus of attack on critical dissent and critical thinking and dissent in academia has so far been sharply posed and sharply focused. And the reason I say Horowitz and the Hitler Youth is that part of the whole effort is to actually enlist, through young Republican clubs and other right-wing organizations, to actively enlist students in colleges, and now it's being carried down to the high schools and even in lower levels of education, to, in effect, spy on and monitor their professors. And whenever their professors or teachers say anything out of line, in effect, with the agenda of the Bush regime and the ways in which that's a driving force at the core of U.S. imperialist interests in the world right now, to report on them, to tape record them, to take notes and report on what they said, and then to feed that into the whole machinery of, what David Brock in his book called the Republican noise machine, all the machinery of the Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and other right-wing talk show hosts, and to marshal, in effect, a whole fascist stampede to harass and even to get these teachers and professors fired. Even ones who are supposedly have the security, for example, of tenure in academia, which Ward Churchill does, or perhaps one is forced to say did, as things are unfolding. And besides everything else as I'll talk about as we go along this evening, besides the overall extremely reactionary content and purpose and character of this, it's also extremely cowardly. And this relates to the whole point about how this is all a cover for a witch hunt and is not the search for the truth. It's cowardly in the sense of, especially when you're talking about college students. Now, I know they've gone through the American public education system. But even keeping that in mind, they're supposed to be capable of thought by the time they get to college. I went to college. My professor said something I didn't like. I challenged him. If he didn't allow me to challenge him, I challenged him some more. Or if she said, "Be quiet, it's out of order," I went to her office and struggled with her. This is part of the pursuit of the truth. This is part of intellectual inquiry and critical thinking. But instead of encouraging these students who disagree with what is an exaggerated representation of the presence and even portrayed as the dominance of liberal and left-wing professors on the college, but if you don't agree with your professor, do some fucking work, you lazy motherfucker. Challenge a professor, and if you can't back it up, then go do some work. Go study. Go do research. You got the internet. talk to other students, and then come back to class and present a case to challenge your professor. And then if the professor won't let you present a case to disagree with what they put forward, then you might have a legitimate grievance. But that's not what's going on. This is not a process whereby students are attempting to challenge in a principled and substantive way what professors are saying that they disagree with. This is a mobilization of, yes, the equivalent of Hitler Youth. This is the kind of thing that went on in the German universities in the early stages of the Nazi regime, singling out Jewish professors in particular, but others in academia who were regarded as threats and obstacles to the regime and its objectives, and going after them and mobilizing students to go after them, as well as other people in the faculty and so on. This is why it is not some kind of hyperbole or outrageous distortion to talk about Horowitz and the Hitler Youth, because this is precisely the kind of thing that they're attempting to implement and are implementing in a very significant way with real and very negative and dangerous impact already, and a much greater potential for far greater negative impact of a very, very significant, in a very, very significant dimension. Now, as I've referred to, at the present time, to a very large degree, this has taken focus around Professor of Native American Studies and in University of Colorado, Ward Churchill. And right in the aftermath of September 11th, Churchill, who's written many things about the genocide against the Native Americans and generally about the criticizing and exposing what the U.S. has done, not only in the history of the country within its own borders or in expanding its borders in North America, but in other parts of the world as well. And from the same standpoint, in the same spirit, he wrote a very sharply worded essay about essentially arguing that this was a case of September 11th was a case of chickens coming home to roost. Look what your government has been doing out here in the world, and what did you expect was going to happen? And in the course of this was included a very provocative formulation about how the people, not all the people, but the people who worked particularly as functionaries for the large corporations that were centered in the World Trade Center, were compared by Churchill in this essay, or were called little Eichmanns, comparing them to the functionaries of the Nazi regime. Well, this essay, in effect, sat there for a while, for a couple of years, and some people read it, and I'm sure some agreed with it, and some agreed with parts of it, and didn't agree with others. Some were outraged by it. But not much happened. And then Churchill was scheduled to make a speech at a small college in New York State. And all of a sudden, what do you know, somebody, again, some of these Hitler Youth types and organized forces, brought to light this essay. And the trumpets started blaring, the Republican noise machine, the fascist instruments of public opinion molding and of persecution, in effect, started raising a tremendous din about this essay. And he was disinvited from speaking at the college in New York, and the faculty person who invited him and the department that faculty person was a part of came under extreme fire. And the governor of the state of New York joined very early with the governor of the state of Colorado in calling for the firing of Churchill on the basis explicitly of this essay. This expression of opinion was beyond the pale, and it couldn't be tolerated, especially from someone in a position in academia. He should be fired explicitly because of the content of this essay. And it should be noted that the governor of Colorado, who immediately set in motion this whole drive to oust Churchill, had already been working with Horowitz, along with a number of other ruling class politicians, in his so-called Fairness in Academia initiative. And we'll see how this fits in with other misnomers, other misnamed, deliberately misnamed fascist offensives, which pose as often as striving for balance or fairness while seeking to persecute and suppress opinions and people who express opinions contrary to the dominant agenda being driven by this core at the center of power of U.S. imperialism now, and their grand designs in the world and their grand strategy. Now, the way in which this process around Churchill unfolded from there is very instructive, and it's worth going into it a little bit because there's a lot that can and really should be learned from this. Along with the governor, many other politicians in the state legislature, where Churchill teaches in Colorado, were also calling for his firing, and even some officials associated with the university itself more closely. And it was notable the way in which the Democratic Party politicians in the state, and indeed in the country, recognizing the importance of this, rallied to the defense of Churchill on the basis of, well, we may not like his particular opinions, but it's extremely important that there be an atmosphere in which opinions are freely expressed. Not. There may have been an isolated voice here or there in some muted form of that, putting that forward in some muted way, but that was overwhelmingly not what they said. They were either deafening by their silence or joining in the chorus of calling for blood. But then it's interesting how it unfolded from there. After a certain point, in stepped David Horowitz. He wrote a piece appearing in the Rocky Mountain News. You can find it online, February 8th, 2005. And here's what he wrote. It was a conscious effort to redirect the effort of going after Churchill in line with the tactics of his whole effort of unleashing an attack on dissent and critical thinking and mounting a many-sided attack on dissent and critical thinking in academia. He said in that piece, "I am opposed to any attempt to fire Ward Churchill for the essay, now part of a book, that has become notorious in which he denounces his own country as a genocidal empire," now note the distortion in the next part, "supports America's terrorist enemies," a very heavy charge in this time, in this period when we're in a state of war. And goes Horowitz, and he says, Churchill says that 9/11 was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Now note carefully the wording here from Horowitz, who is on this whole campaign to purge from academia those who raise criticisms and dissent in regard to the policies of the Bush administration and or the historical crimes of the ruling class of the country more generally down to the present day. Horowitz says that he opposes the firing of Churchill because of the essay in question, even while he misrepresents aspects of what is said in that essay. And Horowitz even attempts to wax eloquent about the importance of the Bill of Rights and academic freedom or fairness in the course of this piece. But then he goes on to say, quote, and we should pay careful attention to this, quote, "If, on the other hand, as some have charged, Churchill is not really a Native American as he claims, then of course he should be fired for fraud," unquote. Now, in one dimension here, Horowitz was playing a kind of good cop, bad cop role in relation to the governor of Colorado. In other words, Horowitz is playing the quote-unquote good cop in relation to the bad cop of the governor who was openly calling for the firing of Churchill on explicitly political grounds, precisely on the basis of the content of his essay. But once again, it's important to keep in mind that these two have been closely aligned. Horowitz and the governor of Colorado, Bill Owens, have been closely aligned in the overall attack on dissent and critical thinking in academia. And while the governor openly and vociferously called for Churchill's firing, precisely on the basis of his essay, playing the bad cop. Horowitz played the good cop, saying, no, we can't fire people for that. After all, America's founded on principles, freedom of speech, and there's the importance of academic freedom. But at the same time, notice again that Horowitz was moving to redirect the focus of attack on Churchill to the arena of alleged academic fraud, seeing that as an avenue for pursuing the persecution and firing of Churchill, and very importantly, and much more broadly, the intimidation of faculty in general, without engaging in the blatant hypocrisy of openly calling for the firing of Churchill for his political views, while Horowitz is raising a hue and cry about supposed political suppression, persecution, and discrimination against conservatives and what are in fact reactionaries in academia. And lo and behold, what did the administration of the University of Colorado do, including its chancellor? They issued a statement that Churchill could not be fired for his essay and his political opinions and statements in general, but he was now being investigated for academic fraud. And even though during the course of this investigation it was decided by those conducting this witch hunt that going after Churchill for falsely claiming to be a Native American would not be very fruitful and could involve all kinds of problems, the investigation into other areas of alleged academic fraud continued and was stepped up with a vengeance. And it's interesting to note in this context what happened to the woman who was the president of the University of Colorado University system during this time. She was herself a Republican, but sort of a more moderate, academic type Republican. Not good enough. There were other scandals at the university with the football program and all kinds of misconduct being alleged and clearly significant bad actions on the part of some of the football players and some of those involved in the football program more broadly. So she was under fire already. But then, early in this whole Churchill affair, if you will, she made a speech in which she raised the specter of McCarthyism. Soon after that, she was gone. Now, nobody said, including her, that she left because of that speech, that she was forced out because of that speech. Other reasons were given. But it was very interesting, shall we say, the coincidence here, that not long after, the quote-unquote coincidence, that not long after making such a speech in which she raised the specter of McCarthyism in the university explicitly, she was gone. And if you dig into this and do research, you'll see that something else was happening at the time, which was the university administration, in the context of this whole thing that had flared up around Churchill, was running around insisting that all of its professors be sure that they had signed the loyalty oath that was still required of them. So on the one hand, this Churchill affair brought to light repressive things that were already going on in the university, and on the other hand was seized on to intensify them. And then this farcical process began in which an academic committee was appointed to review the academic work of Churchill. It had already been reviewed through the normal academic procedures several times. He'd already been given tenure, which requires a review. And they pored literally with a microscope over everything he had written going back years. And their investigation literally focused on, to a significant degree, on things like footnotes. For example, he claimed, and there is a basis for this claim, though it's controversial and there are different interpretations, that there was a deliberate move by the U.S. Army at one point to infect Native Americans with smallpox. Well, in researching this, it's interesting you see that, and there was an article in our party's newspaper about this, that this committee investigating Churchill spent more than 40 pages discussing this particular accusation and the related footnote from Churchill, when Churchill himself in his writings only included a few paragraphs on this. And a couple of things have to be said here. First of all, everybody, even the faculty committee that investigated and then recommended that Churchill either be fired or suspended for long period of time, acknowledged that there was a smelly atmosphere in which this investigation began in the first place, that it began as a result of the bringing to light of unpopular statements by Churchill, and this was not a good atmosphere, but they said, nevertheless, we'll go ahead and carry out this farce and worse than farce. And a couple of things have to be said. Is there a single writer, author, academic, or anyone who has written in any kind of significant volume whose work could withstand this kind of microscopic examination without revealing certain errors, without revealing problematical or controversial authorizations or verifications of facts? As was pointed out by a professor at the University of Colorado, was also mentioned in the article in our party's paper, there have been notable people, not only in the academics, but people who are built up in the media all the time, like Doris Kearns Goodwin, who was caught plagiarizing in a major way. And the penalties she suffered for that were much less than what's being directed against Churchill for errors that are much more, even if you accept them as true, are minuscule by comparison. So clearly this whole academic investigation was a farce and itself a fraud from the beginning. And the second thing that has to be said, and it's interesting, since the head of the committee investigating Churchill for fraud was someone from the law school, we might invoke the analogy of the fruit of the poison tree. Since even you acknowledge that this investigation would never have happened were it not for the outcry about political statements that are supposed to be protected by the First Amendment and the voicing of which are supposed to be an important part of academia and academic freedom, isn't in fact your entire investigation, let alone the way in which you carried it out, tainted itself from the very beginning and illegitimate itself from the very beginning. Fruit of a poison tree, if you will. Or let's pose it the same basic point slightly differently. Let's step back and ask, which is more harmful to academia and to society? That a professor who's written thousands and thousands of words with hundreds and probably thousands of footnotes may have made some minor errors or been guilty of some minor misconduct, be subjected to this kind of a witch hunt, the poring over of his work in this kind of way, with the kind of implications that has in terms of chilling the whole atmosphere in academia generally, and saying to every professor, don't step out of line because none of you, and you all know it, can stand up to this kind of fine-tooth combing through your work. Which is worse for academia and society? To let a professor continue teaching who may have committed certain minor missteps in his academic work in the midst of a very big body of work? Or to fire a professor allegedly for those acts of what are objectively minor misconduct, even if true, as a result of and in the context of and as the outgrowth of an orchestrated campaign to go after him for political statements that he made. Which is worse? Which is more harmful for academia and indeed for society as a whole? To introduce a whole, yes, McCarthyite and even worse atmosphere into academia, or to have a professor who may have been guilty of minor misconduct and who has tenure remain on the faculty. It should be very clear which is far worse, even if you accept some of the charges or the basic charges of academic misconduct. And the reason that that's not being acted upon is because there's an agenda driving this investigation. And it is not some impartial academic process of checking up on a colleague in academia. It's farcical. And let's call it out even more for what it is. Those people, and now it's gotten to the point where the chancellor has called for the firing of Churchill on the basis of these, the legitimation of this is these academic faculty committees that have carried out this investigation. Let's call this and let's call them what they are. These people are acting in the capacity of academic Judenrat. Now, the Judenrat in Nazi Germany were organizations among the Jewish people, and particularly among the more prominent Jewish people, who made agreements with the Nazis to turn over some, even for the death camps, in the name of saving others. And they often turned over the more undesirables, or those who were unemployed, or people in not so prominent positions, in order to try to save others. And they did so, of course, not in the name that they were enamored of or supportive of Nazism, but in order to save other Jews. But that's the role the Judenrat played, and that's the role, in effect, by analogy, that's being played by academic committees and the faculty members on them. Let's call it out for what it is. As, for example, is going on around Churchill. They should be called out for being, in effect, academic Judenrat. You are coughing up and turning over and sacrificing one of your own, supposedly with the motivation, which is the best motivation you could marshal, that you're going to save others, that you're going to preserve the reputation of academia and thereby save it from further assault, which will not happen. It will only contribute to the further assault. And I don't invoke this analogy lightly. Of course, they're not literally sending someone to the death camps. But as we point out many times, that wasn't what happened in 1933 either. This is all part of a momentum going somewhere. And it doesn't necessarily have a preordained particular form of horror that it's heading toward, but it's heading toward horrors of an even greater scale than what's already happening. And the intended effect of this is already being felt. In academia, it's not just your job, it's your whole reputation, your whole career that's on the line. If what happens to Churchill happens to you, you are through. I mean, maybe you'll find some job somewhere, but you are through in the kind of standing that you had in academia, and even in your ability to get a job is very severely impaired is too weak a word, severely damaged. And everybody in academia knows this. And let's be clear, when you go after someone in this way who has tenure, professors who are supposed to be protected, and you move to fire them, as is now happening, you are delivering a message to all of the people in academia that even tenure can't protect you if you step out of line politically. And this is also being accompanied with calls, this attack, focused now to a large degree on Churchill, is being accompanied by calls to review tenure, to undermine, if not outright abolish tenure. And there's no mistaking the chilling effect that this is meant to have, and spontaneously, in the absence of massive resistance by faculty and by students and by others, the effect it will have in chilling things in academia. And this is extremely important in its own right, and it's also important in relation to larger objectives. You're trying to build, for example, among students and on college campuses and universities, a movement of resistance to what's being carried out by the Bush regime and by the government more generally, and to the outrages of society, and, for example, in a concentrated way to drive out the Bush regime. And this kind of chilling atmosphere is being imposed on the campuses. What effect is that going to have on efforts to build among students and on the universities, which are a very important part of building an overall movement of resistance? What effect is that going to have on your ability to do that? Or you want to open up the debate about communism and the historical experience of socialist society and the dictatorship of the proletariat. You want to carry out more broadly and with more impact the Setting the Record Straight project. What impact does it have in terms of getting professors to sponsor or participate in and bring their students to, and even to get students to come out to and be involved in the efforts to do something like that, which is already considered beyond the pale to an overwhelming degree, if this kind of chilling atmosphere is increasingly taking hold? So we should recognize the tremendous stakes involved here. And, some people have said, well, I think it's important to defend academic freedom, but, Ward Churchill, I don't like some things he's done. This is entirely beside the point in this context. I mean, Ward Churchill has written nasty things about us. We have to be more big-minded than that. We have to recognize what's going on here on a much bigger scale. We have to recognize that in the context for which and the basis on which he's being attacked, what he represents in the face of that attack is overwhelmingly positive and needs to be risen. We need to rise to the defense of that. And where we have differences, we should struggle them out in that context from a high plane, looking at the large stakes involved and having largeness of mind and not pettiness of mind and of attitude and of corresponding action. He's not being attacked because he said a few nasty things about our party. That's not why they're firing him from the University of Colorado. And if they were, we should oppose it. But that's not why. We have to struggle and win people to recognize the stakes and to rise to a much loftier and more sweeping view of what is going on here, and not allow things to go rolling down, gathering even further momentum, when it's even much more difficult to mount resistance to this, yes, a real juggernaut, which is beginning to seriously roll in relation to academia as well as other crucial parts of society and in an overall way in society. We have to mount the resistance to this in a very powerful way, and we have to recognize the stakes and have broadness of mind about this, and win others to see the big stakes and to have broadness of mind about it. There should be an outcry and an uproar from faculty, but not only from faculty, from students all over the country about this. Now, that's not going to happen overnight just because we want it to, but it has to be worked toward, where they can't do this kind of thing without universities being shut down in opposition to it. Without the students taking a stand. I mean being shut down by the actions of the students and the faculty striking and moving in protest against this. Now let's examine a little bit the slogans and the stalking horses under which and behind which this is being carried out. Horowitz, in his whole drive for what he misnames fairness, and deliberately misnames fairness in academia, speaks about what is in fact objectively, and this was pointed out in the statement which has been signed by many academics, to defend dissent and critical thinking in academia, is really a ridiculous notion of a left-wing dictatorship in academia. That in key departments and the chairs of the key departments in the university, in other words, the pivotal positions, are all controlled by liberals and left-wingers and America haters and so on and so forth. And no conservative has a chance to get hired, let alone to be promoted within this kind of an atmosphere and this kind of a framework. So let's examine this, what is objectively a ridiculous and completely itself fraudulent notion, completely flying in the face of reality about a left-wing dictatorship in academia. Now, let's look at it all sidedly. There have, in the period of the past few decades, developed a number of places in academia where people coming out of the 60s have become professors, have gotten tenure, have had influence in their departments, and have brought a little truth to light in various ways and challenged the official narrative about America that dominated the universities before the 60s. That's a very positive thing, not a negative thing. And if you don't agree, once more, going back to my earlier point about cowardice, if you don't agree with their challenge to the official narrative, then argue for the official narrative and show how it's true and they're wrong. But that's not what's going on. And there is, in this context, there has grown up in relation to the fluorescence, the growth of identity politics in general, there has grown up some secondary silliness in academia as well as other places in terms of what's often attacked as political correctness and identity politics and the related relativism. There are problems in academia where arguments can be made that, well, for example, there's a big dispute about the influence of Egypt on Greek culture. Now, it's one thing to challenge the accepted narrative about Greek culture and its role in the world, and to argue that Egypt had a greater influence on it than it's been acknowledged before, and that, this is all actually, much more owing to African influences than previously believed. And that should be battled out in the realm of ideas to determine what's true and not true by digging into history and studying and debating and so on. It's another thing which sometimes does happen in this and related things to basically argue that if facts contradict this narrative, then those facts should be discarded. If they, there have been arguments that if facts contradict an Afrocentric narrative about the influence of Egypt, for example, on Greek culture, that those facts don't matter. But this is a very secondary phenomenon in the context of academia and what's going on and what actually dominates an academia. And there's stupid stuff about, look, dead white men. Why do we have to read all these dead white men? Well, a lot of those dead white men have grappled with a lot of important ideas. That's why you should read them and engage them. It's very correct when there was a struggle not to have only dead white men, quote unquote, essentially make up the curricula of universities and of education. But sometimes, yes, things do go to excess, and when they get bound up with the relativism of identity politics, then this can go to a form that begins to take on certain negative dimensions, where essentially you reject anyone who's a dead white man rather than examining whether what they're raising is of importance, whether it's grappling with anything of significance in terms of history and society and science and culture or whatever, and whether it should be engaged as such. But this, once again, is very, very secondary in terms of its influence within academia. And these are the kind of things that are seized on and blown all out of proportion as part of an assault once again, on any challenge to the official narrative about history, either the history of the U.S., the history of the West, the history of Western culture, the history of the world, more recent history and actions by the U.S. government, and what is going on in the world today. So even some of this secondary silliness or incorrect methodology is on the one hand very minor in the context of things, but is blown up as if it were a major feature of what goes on in academia. Now, relativism in academia is something of a problem, and we need to recognize that, and we need, as I've spoken to in other talks, we need to wage a struggle against it. But what I'm saying here is in terms of this imposing some sort of dictatorship of left-wing thought, which doesn't allow any opposing and contrary opinions to it. In terms of that whole picture, this is absurd, and in its absurdity is playing a very significant role in a whole reactionary agenda and offensive. And let's step back for a second and ask, well, what really is the character of these universities? I mean, even with the overwhelmingly positive influence of some of these studies like ethnic studies and women's studies and professors and other faculty members out and departments that have come up out of the 60s and are influenced by that and by other progressive movements. Even with that, what is the main character of these institutions? These are, in their essential character, and it's full of contradiction, as the references I've just made to positive things indicate, but in its principal aspect in defining character, these are ruling class institutions, not only in a general ideological sense, but also in the sense of where the funding is the funding that's bound up with research and projects in the university, and in terms of the political institutions and political operatives who ultimately control as well as funding the universities. The corporate and government structures have tremendous penetration into and influence and ultimate control in an overall sense of the universities. And these oppositional things take place within that context and are, in fact, an aspect in opposition to that. And here again we see the typical, what's becoming already somewhat classical tactics and approach of this whole reactionary and indeed fascist offensive. You claim that you are being persecuted if you cannot thoroughly impose through the institutions and forces of the ruling class and the state your views and your version of history, anything that stands in opposition to and might offer any interference to that constitutes persecution and discrimination against you, even though you have the backing of the ruling class behind you. Poor you. And if you listen, and I'm going to talk about this more, you listen to the arguments of people like David Horowitz, for example, who writes books or has books written in his name or whatever it is. Let's say he writes them and makes talks on campuses and other places. If you listen to the level of their argumentation, it is so shoddy and often so patently and obviously absurd that if you think about it, what it's obviously resting on is raw power behind it. You may not be convinced by my facts, but the power I'm marshaling behind me that's always implied just behind my words will be enough to carry the day. And this is what is really going on. That there are in academia places and pockets and sections where there is still some critical thinking and where it's encouraged and where dissent from the official narrative and official policy still has air to be expressed. Not that this exercises a dictatorship in the universities and the educational system, but it has a little room to exist and to express itself, and that cannot be allowed. That's what has to be stamped out. Because people might go to these universities and hear one of these professors and go one of these classes and say, my God, this self-contained world that I've come out of doesn't have anything to do with the real world out here. And in the context of what's being carried out in the designs of this core of the ruling class this time, that cannot be allowed. Even that. Even what is, I can hardly say it without laughing, what is not a left-wing dictatorship in academia, but is merely the existence of, if you want to put it in those terms, left-wing ideas circulating and contending within academia is what has to be stamped out. Academia is so far, and directly under attack on this basis, but so far a place where there has been in recent times and is still, so far, more place and more space for dissent and critical thinking. It's part of the character still of what the university is like. You find it expressed there more, given the nature of what goes on in academia, than you do in a lot of other spheres of society and other areas of employment, for example. It isn't in the character of working for some high-tech corporation to have debates about philosophy and about the history of the U.S. and about politics and about how did the U.S. come to predominance in the world. That isn't the normal fare, if you will, in most areas of employment within the country. But in academia, that's part of the discourse. That's part of what goes on. And there still is, and this is what's under attack, and I say still is so far, more place and more space for that in academia. And to attack it there is not simply aimed at changing academia in a radically reactionary way, which it is, but it's also aimed at affecting all of society by stamping it out in one place where it has had more room and space to be expressed and to exert influence. And once again, we come back to this phenomenon of the aiming for a self-contained world and a self-contained official narrative outside of which there can be not only no truth, but no attempt to express any truth. And we see the common tactics of these forces. The Christian fascists and other fascist types align with them, including the David Horowitzes. On behalf of this core of ruling class power at this point and its whole agenda and grand designs and strategic orientation and aims. Now, I've talked in other talks about how the Christian fascists pose as if they are early followers of Jesus hurled into the Colosseums of Rome with the lions set loose on them. They are a persecuted group, even though theirs is the semi-official religion of the country. Any restriction on the imposition of their religious fundamentalist views, their literalist taking and rendering of the Bible, any restriction of, in particular, of the use of the mechanisms and institutions of the state and government to enforce that on others and on society in general, constitutes violation of their religious freedom and persecution of them as Christians. And this is a common tactic that these forces use in one arena after another. Think about the media. What is the big complaint about the media? The left-wing media. What is the left-wing media? CNN, CBS. And it's not incidental. He's a ruling class functionary, but look what happened to Dan Rather. And those who were working with him doing a story exposing Bush around the National Guard. Dan Rather was a big figure, and he was driven out. As part of the same kind of concerted campaign utilizing everything from the web blogs to the right-wing talk show hosts and Fox News and other institutions to do it. Just as, it may fall to us to strive to lead a campaign to defend the New York Times, so you have to understand the attacks on Dan Rather in the same sort of context. They're not attacking him because he's been a long-time loyal and effective functionary and voice for the ruling class. They're attacking him because that kind of role for the ruling class is not what's needed now in the eyes and according to the agenda of those driving things within the ruling class and setting the terms largely within the ruling class at this point. And the other sections of the ruling class are too flabby on ruling class terms to see the need to or to be willing and able to mount any kind of significant opposition to this, and they're backpedaling and retreating repeatedly. But they go in the media and they effectively say the same thing they say about academia. There's a left-wing bias, a left-wing dictatorship in the media. They seem to have discovered that the proletariat, particularly as represented by our party, actually controls the media. I thought we had hidden that well enough. But no, this is not what they're talking about. They're talking about the fact that if you raise anything that has any space between it and the agenda and driving force of this core of the ruling class, then you are a left-winger and quite possibly a traitor. People like Ann Coulter wrote a whole book with that very theme, calling all these people traitors. Once again, it's the fascist attack on the German Weimar Republic, by analogy, the bourgeois democratic republic in Germany. And we should understand, not that we should rally to the defense of bourgeois democracy in its own right and in order to preserve it, but as part of the struggle to defeat these forces waging this attack and to take that to a whole other place, repolarizing in the process toward revolution. But as I pointed out before, what is the actual alignment of the spectrum, if you will, of the media? On the one hand, you have openly fascistic voices and forces, like as concentrated in Fox News, and Christian radio, Christian fascist radio, and talk radio to a very large degree is dominated by this. And the other end of the spectrum, as far as the mainstream media, is mainstream imperialist thought and mainstream imperialist disinformation and propaganda, as represented, for example, by the Paulizans. This is the actual spectrum. And so they raise a hue and cry that there's left-wing bias in the media, put this other section of the ruling class on the defensive, getting them backpedaling and making more and more concessions, while they more aggressively dominate the media and the molding of public opinion, with even on ruling class terms. And in sphere after sphere, this is the same tactics that's used as a wedge and as part of a broader strategic approach of achieving domination for this core and its agenda, and the expression and propagation of things consistent with and serving that within the ruling class. In every sphere, the media, in education, I talked in another talk about evolution, or a couple of other talks about evolution. Evolution is being forced down people's throats in the education system. There's not fairness. Can't we have fairness? Can't we have differing views expressed? Why is only one view about reality allowed to be expressed? Why can't we have different versions of reality? But this is all wedge and transitional to eventually suppressing all these, even contrary views coming from a more or less ruling class perspective that don't serve the particular interests of this whole driving force at the core of the ruling class. So this makes it very complex, because you end up, as with the Dan Rathers in the New York Times, sort of saying, well, this is, These are organs of the ruling class and spokespeople and representatives of the ruling class. And here, sometimes we're called upon to join in opposing attacks directed against them. And how do you do that without falling into simply tailing and upholding what they represent as another version of the interests of the ruling class? And this is now becoming very focused, not just in the educational system in general, and not just in the very important way in which it's concentrated around evolution, but also in its directed attack toward academia, and particularly on the college and university level. And what's involved, once again, is the fact that this whole agenda cannot stand up to critical thinking and a rational pursuit of the truth. It has to change the definition of what's the truth and how the truth's arrived at. There's that whole epistemological dimension. And it has to rule out of order and beyond the pale critical thinking and dissent, which would call into question not only the righteousness of particular acts, but foundational things on which the claim to that righteousness is built. If you go around talking and bringing to light, with all of his faults, for example, and limitations, Jim Wallis has a very simple statement in his book, The Soul of Politics. This country was founded on slavery and near genocide. He says, this is not rhetoric, this is just fact. Well, it is. But how does that fact stand in relation to the objectives of this core of the ruling class at this point, and more broadly, for that matter, to the ruling class as a whole? But there are sections of the ruling class who have felt they could allow some of that to come out, and they could still absorb it and still generally co-opt what arose in relationship to it. But this section of the ruling class, with what it sees as necessary in the world and what it has to do inside the U.S. in dialectical relation to that, has to declare and move effectively to create a situation in which that's beyond the pale. Because if you bring out that simple fact that Jim Wallis stated, and you bring that to light for people, they're going to look at events like the Iraq War very differently than if all that is blotted out of history or rewritten to make it look righteous, which is what the narrative was before the 60s by and large, including in academia, by the way. None of this stuff about genocide and all the rest of that. I'm not saying there was never a professor that may have said something about, but that was not the quote-unquote currency. So it's part of this drive to create a self-contained, self-reinforcing world. It goes back to that statement quoted by Ron Suskind in the New York Times when he talked about faith-based as opposed to reality-based communities, and quoted an official of the Bush administration saying, we create our own reality. We're an empire. And while you're studying it oh so judiciously, we go on and make further changes and create further reality. And you can't have discourse and debate and dissent which calls all that and the foundations underneath that into question. Even people like Andrew Sullivan, who partly because he's gay and for other reasons has some contradictions with his whole Bush program, and in particular its whole religious, fanatical, fundamentalist dimension, effectively carried out the same kind of line, for example, on one show of the Bill Maher. When Maher said, well, everybody's always saying to me that one person I should really have on the show is Noam Chomsky. So he put Chomsky on by satellite, and Chomsky started off talking about how what the U.S. did in invading Iraq was, by any definition, a war crime. By the acceptable definition of war crimes, it was a war crime. And Andrew Sullivan, as the saying goes, went ballistic. You can criticize the Iraq war, he said, but you can't say things like that. You can't accuse the U.S. and the government and government officials of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And people like Horowitz are even more fervent, determined, and driven to effect a situation in which you literally can't say that. without being hounded and persecuted and driven out. And academia is a main focus of that now for the reasons that I was speaking to earlier. Now, Horowitz is someone who puts himself forward as a thinker of some substance. And arrogantly and frankly in sort of junior high school terms, denounces people, for example, Cornel West, for being a quote-unquote academic airhead. Ooh. Now, it's interesting and important in light of this to look at his own level and standards of quote-unquote scholarship. As I've mentioned before, Horowitz is someone who not only issued a major statement and put it into newspapers all over the campuses in the U.S., denouncing and opposing the idea of reparations for black people because of slavery and the whole history of oppression, but then he expanded his argumentation in a book called Left Illusions, in which he actually went so far as to say that where's the gratitude of black people toward America? And I have to admit that it took me a while to get around to looking at this book. And when I finally did, not long ago, I was stunned by the level of argumentation over this point in particular. It was incredibly moronic. I mean, first of all, things that are factually not true, as well as things that are just clearly outrageous and even ridiculous. And overtly contrary to fact. For example, he makes a big deal. Well, listen to this argument. There's been lots of slavery throughout history, but it was unprecedented when the U.S. put an end to slavery. Think of the level of that argument. A man is married to a woman for 25 years and beats her with a stick every day. Then, after 25 years, he relents and only beats her with his fist. Where's the gratitude? And it's not even factually true. One of the things that came up, and this is entered into the movie and the story of Amistad, for example, is that other countries in Europe, and in particular England, had not only abolished slavery, but were actively seeking to interfere with the slave trade that was still being carried out in the U.S., even though it was supposed to be illegal. A little ways into the 19th century, in the 1800s. Now, the English ruling class did this not simply out of moral revulsion against slavery, although there was a whole abolitionist movement in England that was very strongly morally motivated. And it's interesting, and this shows us again the complexity and why we need the leap to communism. That a lot of the abolitionist forces in England were the same people who, when Darwin came forward with evolution, vigorously and vociferously opposed it because they were proceeding from a religious-based morality and opposing slavery. And that shows you once again we need a leap to a different historical synthesis. But that's a side point, even though a very important one. But it's just the idea that somehow the U.S. carried out an unprecedented act by abolishing slavery is just not even, first of all, ridiculous, outrageous, and not even in accordance with fact. But again, it's in accordance with a narrative behind which there is an increasingly concerted and powerful drive to impose and to exclude from discourse anything that contradicts that narrative. Or you would think from Horowitz that there was this period of slavery and some bad things happened to black people, but then after slavery is over, everything was fine for them, and there was, they had their chance to get along well in the society. You would never know about the reversal and betrayal of Reconstruction, or at least certainly you would never know about all the devastating effects of that and the generations of horrific oppression and lynching and, the fact that, as one psychologist who studied, I mentioned this in the Talk Revolution, one psychologist who studied black people in the South during this period said, in effect, every black person, particularly those living in the South, lived under a death sentence, which might or might not be carried out, but could at any time. And not only through the normal procedures and official procedures of the law, but by night-riding Ku Klux Klanners and sheriffs acting together with the KKK. Or other statements by people who study this period and have said that it's doubtful that there, particularly with regard to young black males in the South during this period, it is doubtful that there was a single one who was not traumatized by the fear of lynching. Where's the gratitude? And even after these overt forms of oppression in the form of segregation and semi-feudal exploitation on the plantations in a new form between the end of Reconstruction and into the 60s, even after that was largely changed and new forms of oppression were brought forward, look at the situation that the masses of black people have been subjected to and forcibly have had forcibly imposed on them. Particularly those locked into the inner cities, denied employment by both the dynamics of capitalist accumulation and by conscious policy of the ruling class, discriminated against where they do get employment, discriminated against in every sphere of society in a continuing way. As I pointed out before, even Howard Dean brought out, when he got in trouble for talking about how we have to appeal to Southern white guys with Confederate flags on their pickup trucks, then he had to recoup a little bit, and he said, well, I probably didn't say this quite the right way. And then he said, and we do need to have a big conversation about race in America. And he brought out just one of innumerable things like this that could be cited, of how they did a recent study sending people as college graduates applying for jobs to corporations with the same resumes, some black, some white, the same resumes, except some of the whites said they had a conviction for a drug violation, and they were hired before blacks who had an absolutely clean criminal record. Where's the gratitude? Scores and hundreds of black people are murdered by the police, hurling insults and racist epithets along with bullets, and then insulting the family members on top of it. Time after time after time. And you can just look through the media and see all the reports of this. It's an institution that's known about, the throwdown gun, where when the police have killed somebody, usually black or brown in the inner city, they bring out a throwdown gun and put it by the dead body as evidence that they were endangered by the person they just killed. Where's the gratitude? And this is the level of argumentation that we're getting from the likes of David Horowitz. That he even argues this way. Well, listen to this. Well, if you say that all this wealth was created by exploiting black people in slavery, didn't they end up getting some of the wealth? Where's the gratitude? And then the coup de grace is, well, black people in America have a higher standard of living than black people in Africa. So what do they have to complain about? Never mind the centuries of oppression and the horror of the Middle Passage where many were thrown overboard to save the rest of the cargo, or killed when they rebelled, packed together in conditions that are almost indescribable, with each other's feces with their feces all over each other, chained in the holds of ships, robbed of their identities, even their names, their culture, families formed and then broken apart, little children sold away from their parents for generation after generation after generation, while in turn Africa, both the parts from which the slaves were mainly stolen, but other parts as well, was ravaged by colonialism and imperialism. And you have the nerve to talk about how the standard of living in Africa is lower than it is for black people in America? And this is what's presented as respectable and intelligent discourse by the likes of David Horowitz and by his ruling class connections. And when you think about what's actually being argued here, would you have thought a few decades ago that someone would actually come out and make these arguments about slavery and how black people ought to be grateful for it? And that tells you to what extremes things are being taken by this core of the ruling class and how much they have to reverse even partial verdicts that came forward through the course of upsurge in previous times, concentrated in the 60s in the U.S. They even have to go to these extremes. And if this weren't such a horror, what Horowitz is arguing, it would be laughable. And you'd say, and you have the nerve to call someone an academic airhead? But it's not humor, it's horror. These arguments by Horowitz are crude and frankly stupid, moronic, concentrated ignorance, but they serve a very definite purpose and are aiming at having a very definite effect. They provide a rationalization for the system and the ruling class, and in particular those at the core of ruling class power now, and on another level. They provide a rationalization for those, particularly among the more privileged strata in the society, who want to feel justified, even smug in their privileged position, even while this position is inextricably, unavoidably bound up with a history of slavery, continuing oppression, and white supremacy down to the present day in the U.S. Horowitz's line of argument here, as in general, shifts the focus away from essential reality. It offers lies and distortion in place of, and to obstruct, to get in the way of, and to interfere with a real understanding of the actual dynamics of the development of U.S. society and of the actual nature of this society from the beginning down to today in its internal dynamics and in its role in the relationship to the rest of the world and in the interconnection between those two dimensions. Now, in this sphere, for example, speaking about slavery and reparations and the call for gratitude on the part of black people, it might seem that Horowitz wants to allow equal time for views such as this, as outrageous and horrendous as they are. But beyond that, and in reality, he wants views like this and people holding such views to predominate in academia and in society, and to suppress contrary views which might bring out the real history of this country and shed light on what the system and the ruling classes of this country, slave owners and capitalists alike, have actually done and what they are actually doing in the world now. So I want to stop here now, and then we'll have the last section of this talk.